Well, our top story, a federal judge in New York today rejecting a challenge to widespread telephone surveillance by the NSA. The judge ruling the program is indeed legal under the Fourth Amendment, calling it a reasonable way to fight terrorism. This after another federal judge last week ruled the program unconstitutional, calling it Orwellian and saying that our founding fathers would be mortified. Doug Burns is a former federal prosecutor. Brian Claypool is a civil rights litigator, criminal defense attorney. Gentlemen, good to see you both. Doug, Judge Pauley made the ruling today. He essentially said the Fourth Amendment is not absolute. He gave several reasons. We'll put them up on the screen. This, he said, is authorized under the Patriot Act. He said investigating disrupting terrorist attacks outweighs any potential privacy intrusion. And he said there's no evidence of intrusion. He said it's overseen by Congress and the executive branches. And he said, importantly, there's no expectation of privacy when records are held by third parties, the phone companies. And finally, 15 different FISA judges found it to be lawful. What do you think?
Well, you got to break it down into a political analysis and then a legal analysis. Politically, you're going to have those who say this is an outrageous intrusion upon our freedoms, which has some ring of sense to it. And then you're going to have others who are going to always play the Trump card and say fighting terrorism, national security trumps it. Now, legally, the judge, as you explained, said that a dialer of a phone, Greg, does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in conveying the fact that he or she is making that phone call. Legally, that actually makes some sense. And basically, he said that, therefore, there's no expectation of privacy. And remember, and this is very, very important, and that is that this is not eavesdropping and this is not listening to any conversations.
Right.
It's the fact that the data of the calls that are made is being stored.
You know, it's interesting, no expectation of privacy. And the Supreme Court has always said that about third parties holding information. And it's buried here on page 42 in sort of one little line. And, you know, I mean, it took me about an hour to finally find it out of 53 pages. But, Brian, a different judge found this. This is Richard Leon, December 16th. He said, I cannot imagine a more indiscriminate and arbitrary invasion than this systematic and high-tech collection and retention of personal data on virtually every single citizen for purposes of querying and analyzing it without prior judicial approval. He went on to say, surely such a program infringes on that degree of privacy and that the founders enshrined in the Fourth Amendment. So which judge is right? One says it's lawful, the other says it's not.
Well, Greg, I agree with Judge Leon, the first judge, because this is a violation of our Fourth Amendment rights. Think about this. Our criminal justice system is based on you have to proffer probable cause to get a search warrant, for example. You need probable cause to get any affidavits, to issue warrants, to arrest somebody. What happens here is you're setting a precedent that you don't need any facts that establish probable cause. You don't need any facts that establish that somebody should be investigated, let alone you're going to unilaterally garner all this information when we do have a right to privacy through phone calls and in our homes. And I think this also sets a bad precedent and might create complacency within our government. Because during a 3-year time period, Greg, only 277 reports were generated by the FBI. In other words, you cast this wide net, you use all this manpower, and yet what are you accomplishing? We should focus more on ground floor information. You know,
what's interesting, Doug, is that this judge today makes a big deal out of the fact that there have been no intrusions that he's aware of. The government has presented no intrusions. Right. And, Doug, even the president's own presidential panel found no intrusions into Americans' privacy.
Well, working off of Brian's point, you can kind of flip it. I understand what he's saying, but in those 277 reports of the program, it involved approximately 2,900 phone calls. So flipping it on its head, the point is maybe the argument runs it's not all that intrusive. And by the way, Brian's right, you know, there's no requirement for probable cause. But again, my distinction, which is to capture what we call in the trade pen register or trap and trace information, which means just records of calls, there still, under this program, has to be some reasonable probability that terrorism is involved. There's got to be some link of relevance. That's in the opinion also.
You know what? The other thing about this, Brian, is that the Obama administration made a big deal over the course of the last 6-8 months saying, look, this program has prevented about 50 terrorist attacks. And yet Judge Leon said they showed him no evidence of that. And the president's own panel said, we didn't find any evidence of that as well.
Well, that's a good point, and that proves my point, that you're using all of this manpower. You're monitoring millions of phone calls by just random people, and all you can come up with over a 3-year time period is 277 reports, and there's no evidence that any of those reports have abated a terroristic attack. We're better off focusing on ground floor intelligence and not casting this wide net that invades our privacy.
You know, the guy who wrote the computer code for that, who's now retired, he said they're drowning in useless data, and it's really hurting their ability to conduct legitimate surveillance. So, you know, that may be the guy who's right in the long run. We'll have to wait and see. Brian Claypool, Doug Burns, gentlemen, thanks for reacting to this breaking news, our top story today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Greg.
All right.